For centuries, a deep, color-fast blue was one of the rarest commodities on Earth. Getting this exact shade required extracting it from the indigo plant, a process that made the dye so valuable it dictated global trade routes and built entire mercantile empires. But if you tracked that wealth back to its source and arrived in colonial Bihar, you wouldn't find any of it. Instead, you'd find a purely agrarian system, where farmers spent their days tilling the earth with wooden plows and oxen. This diagram shows how the British sharecropping system operated. Under the law, Indian peasants were forced to sign contracts dictating that exactly 15% of their arable land had to be dedicated to growing indigo for their landlords, effectively renting out their most productive soil. Extracting the pigment was grueling, toxic work. The labor permanently dyed the workers' skin a deep blue, marking them physically as subjects bound to the landlord's estate. Because the farmers couldn't grow food on that portion of their land and were paid pennies for the indigo harvest, they sank steadily into arrears. The contract operated as an inescapable loop of debt. By the late 19th century, the British had refined this extraction into a massive, industrialized operation, pulling immense profit from the surrounding peasant holdings. The raw plants were hauled to open-air processing tanks. Laborers spent hours submerged waist-deep in the rotting, fermenting liquid, manually beating the water to oxidize the dye. Overseeing this entire apparatus were British landlords and officials. Backed by the law, the military, and strict social hierarchies, they held absolute authority over a largely illiterate farming class. The farmers were completely isolated from one another. Each sharecropper fought his own individual battle against eviction and starvation. The system relied on this total surveillance and fragmentation. It left the peasantry without any internal mechanism to force a change. The conditions for change finally appeared thousands of miles away, inside the pristine environment of an 1890s chemistry laboratory in Germany. Chemists successfully synthesized indigo. They managed to create a perfect, vibrant blue liquid without using a single leaf, delivering a purely synthetic alternative to the natural market. This chart shows the immediate economic divergence. While natural indigo production remained entirely dependent on weather and human labor, the output for synthetic dye scaled up exponentially within a matter of months, at a fraction of the cost. As a result, the global price of natural indigo collapsed, plummeting to near zero. The British landlords in Bihar realized their primary cash crop was suddenly worthless. A single chemical breakthrough in a European lab wiped out the economic foundation of this colonial agricultural system. But the British planters didn't tell their sharecroppers that the market had crashed. They kept the invention of synthetic dye a secret from the isolated farming villages. Instead, they approached the farmers with an offer. They would release the peasants from the mandatory 15% contract, provided the farmers paid them a massive cash compensation fee. Desperate to escape a system they despised, thousands of farmers borrowed money, sold what little they had, and handed over the cash to break their contracts. Over several years, as travelers and educated activists began visiting the rural districts, they brought reports of the German breakthrough. Word spread that natural indigo no longer had any commercial value. The farmers realized they had been charged exorbitant fees to be released from a crop the landlords could no longer sell. Years of grueling poverty hadn't unified the farmers, but the realization of this calculated deception did. The outright fraud triggered a profound outrage that finally overwhelmed their fear. In 1917, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi arrived in the Champaran district to look into the farmers' grievances. He didn't arrive with a militia. Instead, he systematically traveled from village to village, collecting thousands of documented testimonies to build a case against the extortion. As the investigation progressed, tens of thousands of peasants flocked to the district center to support the effort, creating a massive, highly visible assembly. These were the exact same farmers who had spent their lives isolated in the fields. But by standing shoulder to shoulder in public defiance of the British landlords, they realized their collective strength. The ultimate legacy of the Bihar indigo crop was an unintended revolution. An economic crash triggered in a German laboratory taught an exploited peasantry to be fearless and united.